The transport ship descended through the thin atmosphere of Chorus Prime, and Yuna pressed her face against the small window to catch her first glimpse of the Meridian ruins. Even from orbit, the massive structure dominated the dead planet's surface like a dark scar across gray stone. She had seen countless images during her briefings, but nothing prepared her for the reality of it. The ruins stretched for kilometers in every direction, walls of black material that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Impressive, isn't it? The voice belonged to Juan, the only other human on the transport. He was older than Yuna by a decade, with tired eyes that suggested he had seen too many disappointments in his career. 300 years of study and we still don't know what it's made of. Yuna nodded but didn't look away from the window. The ruins weren't just large. They were wrong somehow, as if they existed slightly out of phase with the rest of reality. The patterns on the walls seemed to shift and move even from this distance, though she knew that was impossible. The landing pad was crowded with vessels from a dozen different species. Yuna recognized the elegant ships of the Vel, all curves and bioorganic materials. The Luminar craft looked like floating crystals, refracting the weak sunlight into rainbow shards. There were species she had only read about in textbooks, beings so different from humanity that finding common ground seemed miraculous. Ambassador Velthar met them at the entrance to the main research facility. The Vel were insectoid in appearance, with 4 arms and compound eyes that seemed to see in more dimensions than Yuna could imagine. Velthar wore the ceremonial robes of his position, deep purple fabric that rustled with each movement. "Welcome to Chorus Prime," Velthar said, his voice translated through the small device attached to his thorax. "We are pleased that humanity has finally chosen to participate in our study." There was something in the way he said finally that made Yuna uncomfortable. She had read the reports. Humanity had been invited to join the Galactic Convergence only 30 years ago, and even then it was considered a courtesy more than a recognition of equals. Earth was young, primitive by galactic standards. Humans had barely mastered faster-than-light travel, when they stumbled into a galaxy already teeming with civilizations millions of years old. "We're honored to be here," Yuna replied, choosing her words carefully. "My brother sends his regards. He couldn't leave his duties, but he made sure I understood the importance of this project." That was a polite lie. Day had spent their last conversation trying to convince her not to come. He thought the whole expedition was a waste of time and resources, a vanity project for species desperate to prove their superiority by solving an ancient mystery. But Yuna had disagreed. The chance to study alien cognitive patterns was too valuable to pass up, even if her role was mostly ceremonial. Velthar led them through the facility, pointing out the various research wings. The compound was massive, housing over 2,000 scientists from 47 different species. Each species had their own approach to studying the ruins. The Luminar used quantum resonance scanning. The Thex employed telepathic probing. The Kolvari had built mathematical models so complex that they required artificial intelligence to process. "And all of them have failed," Juan whispered to Yuna as they walked. 3 centuries, and nobody has cracked even the first layer of the puzzle. The briefing room was filled with beings of every conceivable shape and size. Dr. Kixtren, the Luminar scientist who had dedicated her entire life to the ruins, stood at the center. She was beautiful in an alien way, her crystalline body refracting light into patterns that hurt Yuna's eyes if she looked too long. When Kixtren spoke, her voice chimed like bells. "The Meridian ruins respond to observation," she explained, gesturing to a holographic display that showed the structure's walls. "The patterns change based on who is looking at them. We believe the architects, whoever they were, designed this as a test of consciousness itself." Yuna watched the hologram carefully. The patterns did seem to shift, flowing like water one moment and freezing into geometric precision the next. There was no obvious language, no mathematical formula she could recognize. Just endless variation that seemed to follow rules nobody understood. "Every species has attempted to decode the patterns using their unique cognitive abilities," Kixtren continued. "The Vel can process visual information across 7 different spectrums simultaneously. The Thex can link their minds into a collective consciousness. My own people can perform quantum calculations that would take your computers centuries. And yet, the ruins remain silent." A reptilian being in the back of the room hissed something that Yuna's translator rendered as a question. "Why invite the humans then? No offense intended, but your species lacks any exceptional cognitive abilities. You cannot link minds. You do not see beyond the visible spectrum. Your computational speed is limited by organic neural pathways. Yuna felt her face flush with embarrassment, but Velthar raised one of his 4 hands in a calming gesture. Council Master Thelkor makes a valid observation, though perhaps worded more bluntly than necessary. However, the Convergence has learned that diversity of approach often yields unexpected results. Perhaps a fresh perspective is what we need. It was a diplomatic answer, but Yuna heard the subtext clearly. Nobody expected humanity to contribute anything meaningful. They were here to check a box, to ensure that every member species of the Convergence felt included in this grand project. She was a token, nothing more. The first observation session was scheduled for the following morning, but Yuna couldn't sleep. She spent hours reviewing the data, trying to find patterns that thousands of more advanced minds had missed. It was futile and she knew it, but she couldn't help herself. Her whole life she had been told she wasn't good enough, wasn't smart enough, wasn't special. And now here she was on an alien world about to prove all those voices right. When she finally did visit the ruins the next day, the scale of them stole her breath. The walls towered hundreds of meters above her head, and the patterns carved into their surface seemed to pulse with inner light. She stood in the observation chamber, a transparent dome that allowed her to see the ruins without actually touching them, and simply stared. The patterns moved. She had known they would, but seeing it in person was different. They flowed like thoughts, like the fragments of dreams she could never quite remember when she woke. There was something familiar about them, though she couldn't explain why. Something that tugged at the edges of her consciousness. Then the headache started, a sharp pain behind her eyes that made her gasp and stumble backward. Juan caught her before she fell, his hand steady on her shoulders. "Are you all right?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "I'm fine," Yuna lied, pressing her palm against her forehead. "Just tired from the journey. I think I need to rest." She left the observation chamber feeling foolish and defeated. The ruins had been here for millions of years. They had withstood the scrutiny of the galaxy's greatest minds. What made her think she could understand them in a single day? That night, in her small quarters overlooking the dead landscape of Chorus Prime, Yuna fell into a deep and dreamless sleep. Or so she thought. But somewhere in the darkness behind her closed eyes, something ancient and patient began to stir, reaching out across the void between consciousness and mystery, waiting for a mind that could finally hear its call. The dream started like falling, but without fear. Yuna felt herself descending through layers of reality that shouldn't exist, each one more strange than the last. The ruins were there, but they weren't solid anymore. They were music, a symphony of colors and emotions that flowed through her consciousness like water through open fingers. She could taste the patterns now, sweet and bitter at once, and they sang to her in a language that had no words. She walked through corridors that didn't exist in the physical structure. The walls were memories, she realized. Memories that belonged to beings she had never met. She saw civilizations rise and fall in the space between heartbeats. She felt the weight of millions of years pressing against her mind, but instead of crushing her, it felt like coming home. The patterns spoke to her, not in English or Korean or any language she knew, but in pure meaning that bypassed language entirely. They told her things about herself she had forgotten, things about the universe that nobody was supposed to know, and through it all there was a presence watching her, ancient and patient and infinitely curious. When Yuna woke, sunlight was streaming through her window and her tablet was clutched in her hand. The screen was covered with drawings, complex diagrams that she didn't remember making. Her fingers ached as if she had been writing for hours without stopping. She stared at the sketches, her heart racing. They showed the ruins from angles that shouldn't be possible, three-dimensional maps with annotations and symbols she had never seen before. But somehow, impossibly, she understood them. The symbols meant energy flow and consciousness nexus and dimensional anchor. The knowledge was just there in her head, as natural as knowing her own name. Yuna's hands were shaking as she got dressed. This wasn't normal. This couldn't be normal. She needed to tell someone, but who would believe her? She had been here less than 2 days, and already she was claiming to understand something that had baffled the galaxy's best minds for centuries. She found Juan in the cafeteria, picking at something that might have been breakfast. He looked up when she approached, and his expression immediately shifted from tired to concerned. "You look terrible," he said bluntly. "Did you sleep at all?" "I need to show you something," Yuna said, sliding the tablet across the table. I don't know how to explain this, but last night I had these dreams, and when I woke up, I had made these drawings. Juan studied the screen, his frown deepening with each passing second. These are schematics of the ruins. Where did you get this data? That's what I'm trying to tell you. I didn't get it from anywhere. I dreamed it. He looked at her like she had lost her mind. Maybe she had. But before he could respond, Yuna grabbed the tablet back and pulled up the official survey maps of the ruins. She overlaid her drawings on top of them, and even she could see the problem immediately. Her sketches showed chambers and passages that weren't on any official map. That's impossible, Juan said quietly. We've scanned these ruins with every technology known to the Convergence. If there were hidden chambers, we would have found them. Then check, Yuna said, surprised by the intensity in her own voice. Take my drawings to Dr. Kickstrin.
Run them against the deep scans.
If I'm wrong, I'll admit it and accept whatever psychiatric evaluation you think I need. But if I'm right, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. 2 hours later, Yuna stood in Dr. Kickstrin's laboratory, surrounded by holographic displays that showed scan data from every angle imaginable. The Luminar scientist had been skeptical at first, dismissive even. But as she compared Yuna's sketches to the scan data, something changed in her crystalline features. It was subtle, just a shift in the way light refracted through her body. But Yuna had learned to read alien expressions during her time with the Convergence. There are anomalies in the energy signatures, Kickstrin admitted, her voice no longer chiming with confidence. Fluctuations we attributed to scanning errors or background radiation. But if we recalibrate the sensors based on your drawings, assuming these chambers actually exist, she trailed off, her multiple limbs dancing across control surfaces that Yuna couldn't begin to understand. The holographic display shifted, layers of data peeling away to reveal structures that had been invisible before. Hidden chambers, energy conduits, patterns within patterns. By the ancestors, Kickstrin whispered. How did you know? I told you. I dreamed it. The word hung in the air like an accusation. Dreaming was something primitive species did, an evolutionary holdover from when consciousness was still learning to process information efficiently. Advanced species like the Luminar had evolved beyond such inefficient mental states. They found optimal rest through meditation and neural reorganization, not the chaotic jumble of images and emotions that humans called dreams. That's not possible, Kickstrin said flatly. Dreams are random neural firing. They have no connection to external reality. Then how do you explain this? Yuna gestured at the holographic display, at the proof of impossibility hanging in the air between them. Before Kickstrin could answer, Ambassador Velthar entered the laboratory, followed by 3 other council members including the reptilian Thelkor. Word had spread quickly through the facility, as it always did when something interesting happened. Within minutes, the laboratory was crowded with scientists and diplomats, all trying to see the displays for themselves. Velthar listened to Kickstrin's explanation with his characteristic patience, his compound eyes shifting between the holographic data and Yuna's face. When the Luminar scientist finished, he turned to Yuna directly. You claim you learned this information through dreaming, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Yuna replied, lifting her chin slightly. She wouldn't apologize for something she didn't understand herself. Humans dream, yes, Thelkor hissed from the back of the crowd. But so do many primitive species. It's a waste of neural resources, a sign of cognitive inefficiency. And yet you ask us to believe that this inefficiency somehow gave you insight that centuries of advanced research could not provide? I'm not asking you to believe anything, Yuna said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. I'm showing you what I found. Whether you accept it or not is your decision. Velthar raised one of his 4 hands, silencing Thelkor before the council member could respond. This is unprecedented. If what you say is true, if human dreaming somehow allows you to access information about the ruins that our technology cannot detect, then we must investigate further. Dr. Kickstrin, I want full neural scans of Yuna during her next sleep cycle. Juan, you will supervise as the human expert on consciousness studies. We need to understand what's happening here. That night, Yuna lay in a medical bay surrounded by sensors and monitoring equipment. Juan sat at a nearby console, watching readouts that meant nothing to Yuna. She had volunteered for this, but now that the moment had arrived, she felt a flutter of fear in her chest. What if she couldn't dream again? What if last night had been a fluke, a hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion? Try to relax, Juan said softly. Just let yourself drift off naturally. Don't force anything. Una closed her eyes and tried to quiet her racing thoughts. The medical bay was silent except for the soft hum of alien technology and the steady rhythm of her own breathing. Slowly, gradually, she felt herself beginning to drift. The ruins were waiting for her in the darkness, patient as always, ready to show her things that no waking mind could comprehend. And this time, the sensors would be watching, recording, trying to understand the impossible connection between a human woman's dreams and the greatest mystery in the galaxy. The dream was deeper this time, more vivid and overwhelming. Una found herself standing in a space that was both infinite and impossibly small, where the ruins existed as living thought rather than physical matter. She could see the energy flowing through them now, patterns of consciousness that had been waiting for millions of years for someone to notice them. The patterns weren't just images on walls. They were questions, tests, invitations written in a language that bypassed rational thought entirely. She reached out and touched one of the flowing streams of light, and suddenly she understood. The architects hadn't built these ruins as a monument or a storage facility. They had built them as a bridge between different states of being, a way to reach across the vast gulf between physical existence and something else, something beyond. When Una woke, she was crying. She didn't know why at first, but the emotion was overwhelming, a mixture of joy and loss and recognition that she couldn't put into words. Juan was standing over her, his face pale with shock. "What happened?" Una asked, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "Did you get the readings?" "Yes," Juan said quietly. "But I don't understand them." "Nobody does. You need to see this." He helped her sit up and turned one of the monitors so she could see it. The screen showed her brain activity during sleep, the familiar waves and patterns of human REM cycles. But overlaid on top of that was something else, a frequency that pulsed in perfect synchronization with energy readings from the ruins themselves. "That's impossible," Una whispered. "That's what everyone keeps saying," Juan replied. "But the data doesn't lie. When you entered REM sleep, your neural patterns began resonating with energy signatures from the ruins, not the energy we can normally detect, but a quantum frequency that our sensors barely register. It's been there the whole time, we just didn't know to look for it." The news spread through the facility like wildfire. Within hours, Una found herself in front of the full Convergence Council, a gathering of the most powerful beings in the galaxy. They sat in a circular chamber, each species represented by their ambassador or council member. The weight of their combined attention was almost physical. Dr. Kickstrin presented the findings with her characteristic precision. The scans showed clearly that human REM sleep produced a quantum signature, unlike anything seen in other species. It was a unique blend of order and chaos, logic and irrationality, memory and fantasy, and somehow, impossibly, this signature matched the frequency patterns embedded in the ruins. "We believe the architects designed the ruins to respond specifically to this type of consciousness," Kickstrin explained. "A consciousness that can hold contradictory thoughts simultaneously, that can create meaning from randomness, that can experience impossibility as natural." "In other words," Thelcor said, his reptilian voice dripping with skepticism, "they designed it for primitive minds, for species that haven't evolved beyond the need for dreaming." "Or," Velthar countered carefully, "they designed it for a specific quality of consciousness that more advanced species have lost. Perhaps in our evolution toward efficiency and logic, we sacrificed something that the architects valued." The debate raged for hours. Some council members argued that this was too dangerous to pursue. The ruins could be a trap, a weapon designed to exploit the weaknesses of dreaming minds. Others insisted that this was the breakthrough they had been waiting for, proof that the ruins could finally be understood. Council Master Thelcor was the most vocal opponent. He stood and addressed the chamber with cold authority. "This human has been here less than a week, and already we are ready to abandon centuries of careful research based on dreams and coincidence. Have we learned nothing from our history? Unknown technology should be approached with caution, not reckless enthusiasm. With respect, Council Master," Una said, surprised to find herself speaking up. "The ruins have been approached with caution for 300 years. Maybe it's time to try something different." Thelcor's eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to shrink back, but she held her ground. "And what do you suggest, young human?" That we simply allow you to continue dreaming and hope that something useful emerges from your unconscious mind. Actually, Juan interjected, standing beside Yuna, I have a proposal. With proper monitoring and safety protocols, we could attempt to induce a trance state that mimics REM sleep, while Yuna is conscious and aware. It would allow her to maintain the quantum resonance with the ruins while also being able to communicate what she's experiencing. The chamber erupted in discussion. Some species found the idea fascinating. Others thought it was madness. But Velthar listened carefully, his compound eyes reflecting the chamber's lights in complex patterns. This trance state, he asked Juan, it would require her to enter the ruin's central chamber? Yes, Juan admitted. The resonance is stronger the closer she is to the nexus point. We would need to take her into the heart of the structure. Absolutely not, a voice called from the back of the chamber. Everyone turned to see Day striding into the room, his military uniform crisp despite the long journey from Earth. I won't allow my sister to be used as some kind of experimental probe for your archaeological curiosity. Yuna felt her face flush with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. Dee, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be on Earth. I took emergency leave when I heard what was happening, her brother replied, his expression hard. Someone needs to protect you from these people who see you as nothing more than a useful tool. I volunteered for this, Yuna said firmly. Nobody is forcing me to do anything. Day looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Was it concern, fear, disappointment? You don't understand what you're dealing with. These ruins destroyed the civilization that built them. The architects vanished, Yuna. We don't know if they transcended or died or were consumed by whatever they created. And now you want to follow in their footsteps? I want to understand, Yuna said quietly. That's all I've ever wanted. To understand things that seem impossible, and for the first time in my life, I have a chance to do something that matters, something that nobody else can do. Don't take that away from me. The siblings stared at each other across the council chamber, years of shared history and unspoken arguments hanging between them. Finally, Day sighed and shook his head. Fine, he said. But I'm coming with you. If you're going into those ruins, I'll be there to pull you out if things go wrong. Velthar considered this for a long moment before nodding. The council will vote on the proposal. If approved, we will proceed with every safety measure available to us. Yuna will enter the central chamber in a controlled trance state, monitored by our best scientists and protected by military personnel, including her brother. If at any point the situation becomes dangerous, we will extract her immediately. The vote was close, but it passed. Yuna would descend into the heart of the Meridian ruins, the first being to do so in 300 years of study. The date was set for 3 days hence, giving the scientists time to prepare the equipment and safety protocols. Those 3 days passed in a blur of medical examinations and equipment tests. Juan developed a meditation technique that could induce the trance state, a careful balance between waking consciousness and dream logic. Yuna practiced it for hours each day, learning to walk the line between two states of being. On the night before the descent, Yuna couldn't sleep despite her exhaustion. She stood at her window staring out at the ruins in the darkness. They seemed to glow faintly, though she knew that was probably her imagination. Or maybe it wasn't. Maybe the ruins were calling to her, patient and persistent, waiting for her to finally answer the question they had been asking for 5 million years. Day found her there, standing alone in the dark. He didn't say anything at first, just stood beside her and looked out at the ancient structure that had consumed so much of their lives in recent weeks. I'm proud of you, he said finally, even if I'm terrified for you. Yuna reached out and took her brother's hand, squeezing it gently. I'm terrified too, but I have to do this. You understand that, don't you? I do, Day admitted. I just wish I didn't. They stood together in silence, watching the ruins wait. The descent into the central chamber began at dawn. Yuna wore a specialized suit covered in sensors, each one monitoring a different aspect of her biology and neural activity. Juan walked beside her, checking readouts on his portable display every few seconds. Dee followed behind, armed with weapons that probably wouldn't help against whatever they might find but made him feel better anyway. The entrance to the ruins was a massive archway, carved from the same black material as the walls. Up close, Yuna could see that it wasn't really black at all. It was every color at once, shifting and changing too quickly for her eyes to follow. The patterns were more intense here, almost alive in the way they moved and flowed. Remember, Juan said as they crossed the threshold, if you feel any pain or discomfort, tell us immediately. We can stop this at any time. Yuna nodded but didn't trust herself to speak. Her heart was racing and every instinct screamed at her to turn back. But she kept walking, one foot in front of the other, deeper into the structure that had waited millions of years for this moment. The interior of the ruins was nothing like she expected. The walls were transparent, showing not stone but layers of something that looked like frozen light. She could see through them into spaces that shouldn't exist, rooms and corridors that occupied the same physical location, but existed in different dimensions somehow. It hurt her brain to look at too closely. Starting the trance induction, Juan said softly. Remember the breathing pattern we practiced. In through your nose, hold for 4 counts, out through your mouth. Yuna followed the instructions, feeling her consciousness beginning to shift. The waking world grew distant, dreamlike. The ruins grew more real, more present. She could hear them now. A sound like singing that came from everywhere and nowhere at once. The team reached the central chamber after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Time was strange here, elastic and unreliable. The chamber was a perfect sphere, and at its center floated a sphere of pure light that pulsed in rhythm with Yuna's heartbeat. The Nexus, Dr. Kickstrin breathed, her crystalline body reflecting the light into 1,000 rainbows. After all these years, we're finally here. Yuna walked forward as if pulled by invisible strings. The trance was deeper now, and she existed in 2 places at once. Part of her was still in her body, still aware of her brother standing protectively nearby and the scientists watching with instruments she couldn't understand. But another part of her was already reaching out toward the Nexus, drawn by a recognition so deep, it felt like coming home. Yuna, wait, Day called out, but she barely heard him. Her hand extended toward the sphere of light, and the moment her fingers touched its surface, the universe exploded into meaning. The ruins came alive. The walls stopped being walls and became windows into pure information. The compressed memories and knowledge of an entire civilization condensed into a space that existed outside normal physics. Yuna's consciousness expanded, stretching beyond the boundaries of her body, her species, her understanding of what consciousness even meant. She experienced millions of years in seconds. The rise of the architects from primitive organisms to beings of pure thought, their mastery of physics, of consciousness itself, of the fundamental nature of reality. She felt their joy at discovering they weren't alone in the universe, their sorrow at realizing that most species would never understand what they had become. The architects hadn't died. They had transcended, leaving behind physical form to exist as pure consciousness in dimensions that had no name. But they left the ruins as a beacon, a test for other species that might one day be ready to join them. The test wasn't about intelligence. The galaxy was full of intelligent species, beings that could calculate faster and think clearer than the architects ever could. The test was about something else, something rarer and more precious. It was about imagination, creativity, the ability to think in paradoxes, to hold impossible ideas in your mind and make them feel real. It was about dreaming. The architects had discovered that consciousness wasn't a tool for solving problems. It was the problem and the solution and the question itself. Most species evolved toward efficiency, toward logic and calculation and ordered thought, but in doing so they lost something vital. They lost the ability to dream, to imagine things that couldn't exist and believe in them anyway. Humans still dreamed, despite everything, despite reaching the stars and joining the galactic community. Humans still spent 1/3 of their lives in irrational, chaotic, beautiful dreams, and that made them unique in a galaxy full of logical minds. Through Yuna's connection to the Nexus, the architect's message flowed outward to every observer. It reached through the sensors and monitors, through the communication systems, broadcasting to every ship and station in orbit around Chorus Prime. Within minutes, it would reach across the galaxy, touching billions of minds. The message was simple but profound. You are not broken for dreaming. You are not primitive for feeling emotions that don't make sense. Consciousness is not meant to be efficient. It's meant to be alive, messy, contradictory, and impossible. We built these ruins to find minds that still remember this truth. We built them to find dreamers. Yuna felt tears streaming down her face, but she didn't know if they were hers or belonged to the ancient beings whose memories she was experiencing. The architects were offering her a choice. She could accept their invitation fully, letting her consciousness join theirs in the spaces between dimensions. She would become pure thought, eternal and unchanging, existing in a state beyond anything physical beings could comprehend. Or she could refuse. The temptation was overwhelming. To exist forever, to know everything, to be part of something so vast and ancient that individual identity became meaningless. But as Yuna stood on the threshold of transcendence, she thought about her brother standing behind her, worried and protective. She thought about Juan and his tired eyes that lit up when he talked about consciousness research. She thought about Earth, small and young and full of messy, dreaming humans. She thought about coffee in the morning and the sound of rain on windows. She thought about arguments with Day, and the satisfaction of solving difficult problems and the simple joy of falling asleep after a long day. She thought about all the small, ordinary, beautiful things that made up a life. Transcendence was magnificent, but it was also final. Once she crossed that threshold, there would be no coming back. She would lose everything that made her Yuna, everything that made her human. No, she whispered, and the word echoed through dimensions. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I have a different idea. Through her connection to the Nexus, Yuna reached out to the architects with a proposal. Humans could maintain a connection to their realm without abandoning physical existence. It would be like dreaming, a state where consciousness could touch the infinite while still remaining tethered to the real. Other species could learn this too, if they were willing to remember how to dream. The architects considered this for what felt like years but was only a heartbeat. Then incredibly they agreed. The ruins reconfigured themselves, transforming from a test into a bridge. The walls became permeable, allowing thoughts to pass through while keeping physical forms safe. The Nexus remained but changed, becoming a gateway rather than a doorway. Yuna pulled her hand back from the sphere of light and suddenly she was fully in her body again. She gasped for air, stumbling backward into Day's arms. Her brother caught her, holding her steady as the chamber around them continued to transform. "What did you do?" Kixtrin asked, her voice full of wonder and confusion. "The readings are going insane. The ruins are completely restructuring themselves." "I negotiated," Yuna said, her voice hoarse from crying. "The architects wanted us to join them, but I asked for something different. A partnership instead of transcendence. We can learn from them without losing ourselves." Velthar approached slowly, his compound eyes focused on Yuna, with an intensity she had never seen before. "You refused transcendence. You chose to remain physical, limited mortal. Why?" Yuna looked at her brother, then at the scientists gathered around them, then back at the ambassador. "Because being limited is what makes us alive. The architects are incredible, but they're not really living anymore. They're existing, experiencing, but they're not growing or changing or making mistakes. And those things matter. At least they matter to me." Day stayed on Chorus Prime longer than he intended, drawn by curiosity despite his initial skepticism. One evening, Yuna found him standing in the observation chamber, staring at the ruins with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Not accepting their offer? You could have been immortal, all-knowing. You gave that up for this." Yuna stood beside her brother and looked out at the ruins. They glowed softly in the twilight, beautiful and strange and full of possibility. "I don't regret it," she said honestly. "The architects exist forever, but they don't really live anymore. They don't grow or change or surprise themselves. They just are. But us, we get to wake up every morning and not know what's going to happen. We get to make mistakes and learn from them. We get to dream about impossible things and then figure out how to make them real." "When you put it that way," Day said with a slight smile, "mortality doesn't sound so bad." "It's not bad at all," Yuna agreed. "It's just honest." Years later, the Dream Institute had expanded to multiple locations across the galaxy. Yuna trained new dreamwalkers, beings who could bridge the gap between conscious thought and dream logic. She wrote books about consciousness and imagination that became required reading for students of every species. She gave lectures to audiences that sometimes numbered in the millions. But her favorite moments were still the quiet ones. Late at night in her quarters on Chorus Prime, she would fall asleep and dream. Sometimes she dreamed about her childhood on Earth, about arguments with Day and the smell of her mother's cooking. Sometimes she dreamed about impossible cities and colors that didn't exist and conversations with beings who lived in dimensions she couldn't name. And sometimes, on the best nights, she dreamed about the architects. They were still there, patient and ancient, existing in their eternal state beyond physical reality. They didn't speak in words, but she could feel their gratitude, their joy at finally being understood. Thank you for remembering how to dream, they told her across the vast distance between dimensions. Thank you for teaching others. We were alone for so long, waiting for someone who could hear us. You're welcome, Yuna whispered into the darkness of her dream, and thank you for waiting. Thank you for building something beautiful and leaving it for us to find. On the last night of her life, decades later, Yuna fell asleep in her bed surrounded by friends from a dozen different species. Her body was old and tired, but her mind was still sharp, still dreaming. She felt herself drifting deeper than usual, past the familiar landscapes of her sleeping mind into spaces she had only glimpsed before. The architects were there, welcoming and warm. They didn't ask if she was ready this time. They didn't need to. She had lived a full life, had taught the galaxy the value of dreams, had bridged the gap between physical existence and transcendent consciousness. She had done what she set out to do. Now, they asked simply. Yuna smiled in her dream and took the final step across the threshold. Her body stopped breathing in the physical world, but her consciousness continued expanding into infinite possibility. She became pure thought, eternal and unchanging, joining the architects in their patient vigil. But even in transcendence, a part of her never stopped dreaming, because that was what made her human, and human she would always be. Even in the spaces between dimensions where dreams and reality were the same thing, the ruins on Chorus Prime continued to glow softly in the darkness, teaching new generations the art of dreaming, the value of chaos, and the simple truth that the universe needed both logic and imagination, both order and dreams. And somewhere in the spaces beyond space, Yuna smiled and watched over them all, dreaming still. The ruins became something new in the days that followed. The dark walls turned translucent, showing glimpses of the knowledge within without overwhelming those who looked. The patterns still moved and shifted, but now they responded gently to observation, like a teacher adjusting their lesson to match a student's ability to understand. Yuna became the first Dreamwalker, a title that felt both grand and ridiculous. Her role was to help others learn to access the ruins' knowledge through the state of consciousness humans call dreaming. It was harder than it sounded. Most species had spent millions of years evolving away from dreams, training their minds to be efficient and logical at all times. The Luminar were particularly frustrated. Dr. Kickstrin spent hours in meditation, trying to achieve the mental state that came so naturally to humans. But her crystalline mind resisted, automatically organizing and cataloging every thought into neat categories. There was no chaos in her consciousness, no irrational leaps or impossible connections. I don't understand, she said to Yuna during one training session. How do you make your mind stop making sense? Yuna laughed despite herself. That's the problem right there. You're trying to make your mind do something. Dreams don't work that way. You have to let go of control. Let your thoughts wander where they want to go. It's like falling, but trusting that you'll land somewhere interesting. But that's terrifying, Kickstrin replied. What if I lose myself in the chaos? You won't, Yuna assured her. That's what makes dreaming safe. No matter how strange or impossible the dream becomes, you always wake up. You always come back to yourself. It took weeks, but eventually Kickstrin managed to enter a dreamlike state. Her first experience with the ruins' knowledge was brief and overwhelming. But when she emerged, her crystalline body was glowing with colors Yuna had never seen before. I saw their mathematics, Kickstrin whispered in awe, not as equations but as living shapes that danced and sang. I understood concepts that my species has been working on for millennia, but I understood them through feeling rather than calculation. It was beautiful and impossible and completely illogical, and it worked. The news spread throughout the galactic convergence. Scientists and philosophers from every species came to Chorus Prime to study with Yuna, to learn the art of human-style dreaming. Some succeeded quickly. Others struggled for months. A few never managed it at all, their minds too structured to embrace chaos. Juan established the Dream Institute, a facility dedicated to teaching consciousness flexibility to beings from across the galaxy. It was strange and wonderful to see the Institute's halls filled with creatures of every imaginable shape and size, all trying to learn something that human children did naturally every night. But not everyone was happy with these changes. Council Master Thelcor remained skeptical, and his faction within the convergence grew louder as the weeks passed. They argued that the ruins were changing the fundamental nature of galactic civilization, that encouraging species to embrace irrationality and chaos would lead to disaster. We evolved beyond dreaming for a reason, Thelkor said during one heated council session. We became logical beings because logic works. It builds civilization, solves problems, creates order from chaos. Now you ask us to regress, to embrace the primitive mental states we spent millions of years leaving behind. Velthar listened patiently as always, but Yuna could see the concern in his posture. The ambassador had supported her from the beginning, but the political pressure was mounting. Some species were threatening to leave the convergence entirely, if the Dream Institute wasn't shut down. Perhaps we need to demonstrate the practical value of dream knowledge, Velthar suggested during a private meeting with Yuna and Juan. Council Master Thelkor and his supporters see dreaming as purely mystical, divorced from reality. If we could show them concrete benefits, practical applications, it might ease their concerns. Yuna thought about this as she walked through the ruins that evening. The structure had become familiar to her now, almost comfortable. She could feel the architect's presence like a warm background hum, patient and encouraging. They had waited 5 million years for someone to understand them. They could wait a bit longer for the galaxy to accept what they offered. The answer came to her in a dream, naturally. The convergence had been struggling with a problem for decades. The expansion of faster-than-light travel created navigational challenges that even their most advanced computers couldn't fully solve. The mathematics were too complex, involving quantum variables that changed based on observation itself. But in her dream, Yuna saw the solution. Not as equations, but as flowing patterns that made intuitive sense. The problem wasn't that the computers weren't powerful enough. The problem was that they were trying to calculate something that couldn't be calculated, only felt. She woke and immediately contacted Juan, who was skeptical until she showed him the pattern she had drawn. He brought in Kikstrin and several other mathematicians, and together they worked to translate Yuna's intuitive understanding into something practical. The result was a new type of navigation system that combined quantum computing with dream state processing. It worked better than anyone expected, cutting travel times by 30% and making previously unreachable regions of space accessible for the first time. When Yuna presented the system to the Convergence Council, even Thelkor couldn't deny the value. The Dream Institute received full funding and support, and the political opposition began to crumble. I owe you an apology, Thelkor said to Yuna after the council session. The words clearly didn't come easily to the proud reptilian. I judged humanity based on surface observations, on perceived primitiveness. I failed to see that what I considered a weakness was actually a strength. You're not the first person to underestimate humans, Yuna replied with a slight smile. We're kind of used to it. Months passed, and the ruins became a thriving center of learning and discovery. Beings from across the galaxy came to learn to dream, to touch the knowledge the architects had left behind. Some found it easy, embracing the chaos and irrationality with joy. Others struggled but persevered, slowly learning to let go of their rigid mental structures. The convergence itself began to change. Decisions that once would have been made through pure logic now incorporated intuition and creativity. Art flourished as species that had never considered aesthetic expression suddenly discovered the joy of creating something beautiful for its own sake. Even warfare decreased as empathy and emotional understanding became valued alongside strategy and calculation. Day stayed on Chorus Prime longer than he intended, drawn by curiosity despite his initial skepticism. One evening, Yuna found him standing in the observation chamber, staring at the ruins with an expression she couldn't quite read. Do you ever regret it? He asked. Not accepting their offer? You could have been immortal, all-knowing. You gave that up for this. Yuna stood beside her brother and looked out at the ruins. They glowed softly in the twilight, beautiful and strange and full of possibility. I don't regret it, she said honestly. The architects exist forever, but they don't really live anymore. They don't grow or change or surprise themselves. They just are. But us? We get to wake up every morning and not know what's going to happen. We get to make mistakes and learn from them. We get to dream about impossible things and then figure out how to make them real. When you put it that way, Day said with a slight smile, mortality doesn't sound so bad. It's not bad at all, Yuna agreed. It's just honest. Years later, the Dream Institute had expanded to multiple locations across the galaxy. Yuna trained new dreamwalkers, beings who could bridge the gap between conscious thought and dream logic. She wrote books about consciousness and imagination, that became required reading for students of every species. She gave lectures to audiences that sometimes numbered in the millions, but her favorite moments were still the quiet ones. Late at night in her quarters on Chorus Prime, she would fall asleep and dream. Sometimes she dreamed about her childhood on Earth, about arguments with Day and the smell of her mother's cooking. Sometimes she dreamed about impossible cities and colors that didn't exist, and conversations with beings who lived in dimensions she couldn't name. And sometimes, on the best nights, she dreamed about the architects. They were still there, patient and ancient, existing in their eternal state beyond physical reality. They didn't speak in words, but she could feel their gratitude, their joy at finally being understood. "Thank you for remembering how to dream," they told her across the vast distance between dimensions. "Thank you for teaching others. We were alone for so long, waiting for someone who could hear us." "You're welcome," Una whispered into the darkness of her dream. "And thank you for waiting. Thank you for building something beautiful and leaving it for us to find." On the last night of her life, decades later, Una fell asleep in her bed, surrounded by friends from a dozen different species. Her body was old and tired, but her mind was still sharp, still dreaming. She felt herself drifting deeper than usual, past the familiar landscapes of her sleeping mind into spaces she had only glimpsed before. The architects were there, welcoming and warm. They didn't ask if she was ready this time. They didn't need to. She had lived a full life, had taught the galaxy the value of dreams, had bridged the gap between physical existence and transcendent consciousness. She had done what she set out to do. Now, they asked simply. Una smiled in her dream and took the final step across the threshold. Her body stopped breathing in the physical world, but her consciousness continued, expanding into infinite possibility. She became pure thought, eternal and unchanging, joining the architects in their patient vigil. But even in transcendence, a part of her never stopped dreaming, because that was what made her human, and human she would always be, even in the spaces between dimensions where dreams and reality were the same thing. The ruins on Chorus Prime continued to glow softly in the darkness, teaching new generations the art of dreaming, the value of chaos, and the simple truth that the universe needed both logic and imagination, both order and dreams. And somewhere in the spaces beyond space, Una smiled and watched over them all, dreaming still.